thank you all for joining us this morning. As I said, my name is Jeff Brosco, and I'm a developmental pediatrician here at the Mailman Center for Child Development and the Associate Director. I'm part of the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And we're very glad to have you joining us this morning. I wonder, Rosny, if we could go to the title slide, since I think everyone has that CME code who needs it. If we go to the title slide, that would be great. I'm going to give a very brief introduction since we're already running about 5 minutes behind. And we really do try to end at 10 of the hour because all of us go from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. So I'll just say quickly that Jill and Jason are amazing. So Jill is a professor, as you can see there, and Jason is an associate professor. They are both psychologists by training, and they are the remarkable sorts of faculty who are able to do clinical work, train folks, write grants, publish papers, and do everything, and still improve the system of care more broadly. There are 400,000 at least children in the state of Florida who have a behavioral health or mental health condition, and fewer than half get any treatment. Just let that sink in for a second. 400,000 children and only half getting treatment. If we said there were, excuse me, my dog is excited now. If we understood that there were that many children with cancer not getting treatment, we would get very upset, and we need to try to fix this. And so we at Children's Medical Services and the Department of Health are working on a statewide approach to trying to improve the system of care. We think that what Jill and Jason have to say today can help with that by showing us ways that we can treat many children. So I'm just going to turn it over to them. Jason, are you starting?
Yep, you're all stuck with me first. Thank you all for getting up here bright and early to come hang out with us. Jill and I are real excited to talk to you about some of our current efforts that we've been doing to really leverage technology to promote both caregiver and child mental health. Things that we're really hoping as we're talking about technology today is give you kind of an overview as it relates to technologically assisted or even driven types of behavioral intervention for pediatric externalizing and internalizing disorders that can also have impact on the caregivers within those families. So first up, you're gonna be stuck listening to me, where I'm gonna talk a little bit more about kind of what that looks like within the constructs of behavioral parent training approaches as it relates to family outcomes, which tends to be more geared for children with disruptive behaviors. And then after I'm done talking about those things, Jill's going to be talking a bit more about ongoing research and telehealth and brief digital interventions more for internalizing disorders for caregivers and youth. So just kind of listen out our disclosures as we have related to that talk. I'll give you a moment just to read that. And we're going to keep on plugging along. So as Jeff was just mentioning just a few moments ago, there's a large proportion of the general population that is in need of mental health services. And when we think about that, we're talking about 20 to 40% of youth have what would be considered a psychiatric disorder. And the part that is also so concerning about that is up to 50%, depending on which study, is saying that those youth are not actually ever enrolling in treatment in the first place. Now, the more troublesome thing is once they actually get into treatment, is that greater than 50% of those who actually made it to treatment don't actually meet kind of what would be their treatment goals. So they're terminating treatment earlier than we would hope for them to. Now, they may get better, but they may not get that full dose of what we think would allow for longer term outcomes. And then we know for more vulnerable populations that if youth who are getting referred to more, let's say, community mental health centers, which is where our primary driver of where mental health is received as it relates to therapy, is that for those that have high levels of psychosocial stress, or those who have lower socioeconomic status, or even the caregivers, if they have their own symptomatology. Remember, caregivers really serve as that gatekeeper to whether or not a youth may get services or not. All of those things also can negatively impact treatment participation. And what we're here to talk to you about today is that there may be some technology solutions that may increase the access so that we're reaching more people and or potentially the efficiency of services. So we're going to be talking about these technology delivery of behavioral interventions for pediatric externalizing and internalizing disorders as an example. There's a much broader digital intervention literature that exists. So we're just going to give you a sample of some of the things that we have been working on. And when we think about these technology approaches for mental health services, so technology can really exist in many different ways in terms of our delivery. There can be completely and totally self-directed service modules. So that could be a website, that could be a behavioral health app, where it's really just up to the person or the participant to decide when they want to use it, how they want to use it, and for how long they want to use it. Now, there's been a drive in the past 5 to 10 years where it's still primarily self-directed, but now they've realized that we need to include either human and or AI or natural language processing support within there that essentially allows people to get some type of feedback. So for those of you who perhaps have like a smartwatch, your smartwatch may tell you when you need to stand up, or like, hey, you should have been exercising by now and you have not started. So you're getting kind of AI feedback in terms of like to encourage you or remind you to engage in particular behaviors. And then there's technology augmentations to traditional services. So these are the typical course of delivery of services where there's been some technology augmentation that is designed to hopefully improve family outcomes or perhaps even the efficiency or engagement in services. And then there's things that are technology driven services. So these are the things that we think of more of like the things that we think would be happening within either a brief or a traditional length of services that are happening over telehealth. So I'm going to talk about that first part related to parent training, and I'm going to get right into it. So the first thing is just kind of going from that bottom to top approach and to self-directed all the way up to telehealth. So I'm going to give you some examples of things that we've been doing within the treatment that we offer here at University of Miami called parent-child interaction therapy. Now, I will say that parent-child interaction therapy historically is a live coaching model of parent training. You have the parent or caregiver in a room with their child. They're wearing a earpiece where they're receiving live coaching from a therapist in another room. And they're learning things about positive attention and positive interactions with their child. And they also learn effective discipline techniques on like how to give effective commands and give consistent follow through. So what we wanted to do is we realized that not everyone can commit to something like that. So we developed a self-directed website where people could engage in this online intervention. And this came actually out of work from Michelle Berkovitz, who leads up our early steps programs, where she did essentially like a paper version of like, hey, if you just read about PCIT, or you do a shortened version of PCIT, which is primary care PCIT, that's over just kind of a 1-month period, she was still getting nice treatment effects with the families that were going through that. So we said, well, let's provide a web-based version of that, where essentially we're teaching people the behavioral principles of what PCIT is, through the use of text, through the use of video demonstrations, expert explanations, parent testimonies. And there's also concrete examples of how you can actually implement each of those skills built into the website. So we've been doing this for about a year, and in terms of people that have actually enrolled in the study, we've had close to about 200. And we're really hitting kind of at that PCIT age range that we want to be hitting within that. Disruptive behaviors tend to be more prevalent within males. Compared to our Miami sample, I would say that this sample is a little bit less diverse than the families that we typically serve, but this has been advertised locally, and it's also advertised kind of on like a national PCIT website. We tend to be hitting with more of like a middle class group, but at least with what we're getting down here, sometimes that happens as well. And in terms of where people who are choosing to access this so far, it does seem like we are hitting with a college educated caregiver sample more so than those with a lower education level. So we know that there's some things we need to do to kind of shift that engagement. Now, there is a big drop off, and this is not all that different from monthly utilization rates of what we see in behavioral health, where there can be anywhere from like a 20 to 30% utilization, is that we gave them access, and essentially they got online administrations of measures on a weekly basis over a 1-month period. But what's nice to see is for those that aren't completing, we are seeing some nice treatment effects where things are moving in the right way. Now, I want to be clear is when we measure behavior, normally you want to see those behaviors going down, but we measure them in a strength-based way. So we were actually looking at the assessment of the frequency of positive behaviors that the child was displaying. And our sample, even though we designed this for at risk and not like a clinically significant sample, is that they were actually below that, that clinical cutoff. And so what was nice is over that 4-week period is that our sample was significantly increasing the parents' perceptions of the positive behaviors that they were displaying in the home. And we looked at as a subset of the parental stress the parenting stress index. And even though they weren't clinically significant, we did still see that parental distress was going down over time. So again, engagement with this initial sample is not super high. I think one of the things that we like to give lessons learned when we're talking about digital interventions is that some of us, we use burner email addresses when we sign up for things, of like the things that like, okay, I got to give you my email, but I don't really want to be bothered with that. And I think that happens somewhat with this. And we know that more people are using it than those that are choosing to complete the form. So over the past year, we've had over 17,000 page views and over 5,400 unique visits just in a year of this website being up. So we know that we have to work on some measurement issues as related to it. But again, because this is self-directed, we have to know and take into account that things like the parent's time, attention, and motivation is going to dictate how much they're willing to engage in that digital intervention. And a lot of behavioral interventions that have gone digital, they have become very initially didactic or educational in terms of their content delivery. And I would say that our website initially is that, and that engaging interactions that can happen that can help within that. I don't think that we have that quite there where we want to have it. And we also know from the general literature as it relates to mHealth is that having the lack of a coach or some type of human support to support that continued engagement, that also can help with these things. So we know that behavior change is really, really difficult, but we did not have that in this instance. But just thinking about this from a cost perspective, now obviously there's a lot more that went into the development of this, but in terms of just the maintenance, like for this website to host it, like we pay under $300 a year. So for our completer, like that ends up being a cost of about like less than $7 per person. Now we're grant funded through the Children's Trust to deliver these services in a traditional way, and the cost per family is over $3,000. So we think that there's something there. I think that we just need to work on how to improve the engagement for the intervention. Now, moving more to that self-directed way of doing things, but with having some human or AI support, we know that temper tantrums in children are very, very common. And led by Angela Blizzard, who's the PI on this project and works as a part of a state initiative, but she also works as part of our professional development program. So we got some funding from the CTSI to begin to kind of mock up a mixed reality intervention to teach adults on how to respond to children's disruptive behaviors. And mixed reality is a little bit different from augmented reality or virtual reality. So it projects images and sound into your natural environment. You're wearing these goggles, but if you'll see the joystick on the bottom is that you can actually physically interact with the virtual world that's being projected into your physical environment. And I think we'll hear sound, but you guys can raise hands quick. So what we've worked on in kind of this initial mock-up is that we know that when you give visual attention to these temper tantrums, that they can actually increase. So the idea is it also has eye tracking that's built into the goggles, is when you're looking at the child during a tantrum, that is going to increase. And then it's going to decrease when you look away. Now, I think that we're still working on doing that. This has been a great opportunity to collaborate with the College of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science with respect to this. They've been great partners in this process. This is not something that we could have done on our own. So let's just show you what it looks like.
Hello, my name is Jonathan. I am a kid avatar for the tantrum simulation. Let's start the simulation process. Can I play with your phone?
Not right now, I'm using it.
It's my turn.
Not right now, please wait until I'm done using it.
Why can't I have it? You're the worst.
So if you notice, even when you looked a little bit further away from the child's face, so you're giving less visual attention, that the tantrum was going down. So this is just kind of initial mock-up. We know that there's some things we need to work on, but we're really excited about this opportunity to move in that. I think this idea of moving in this direction is pretty exciting because you're getting visual feedback. One of the things that we hope to integrate into a future iteration of this is to engage language processing as well, so that depending on what the adult is saying to the avatar, it's going to also help whether or not the child calms down or continues to escalate. So, there was periods in there where the child was quiet. So if the caregiver or adult would have praised for that quiet, like that tantrum coefficient would have went down. But if you're talking to the child when they're in the middle of the tantrum, that tantrum coefficient would go up. So it's been a real great team effort on that so far. Whoops, let's move on. So moving towards that eBook plus PCIT as a technology augmented PCIT is that preceding all of this, we kind of did like hey, if we have a multimedia ebook and we add that to services, will that actually, make treatment better? So this is a great collaboration from our PCIT team. So Drew Rothenberg, Elson Weinstein, Jocelyn Stokes, who's on faculty at West Virginia now, and some of our former students and Nelly Garcia have been working on this. And what we did is we did RCT, because one of the things we know about PCIT is it's a really robust intervention for reducing disruptive behaviors. And one of the things that comes into play with that is that sometimes less is actually more. So in the meta-analysis, they saw when you added adjunct things, or you added kind of even different ways of delivering services that had a tendency to reduce the overall effectiveness of treatment. So we conducted a randomized control trial to see if the eBook plus PCIT, like how it fared against traditional PCIT. And this eBook was really focused on that first phase of treatment. So we only gave them the eBook because we were giving them each tablets, and this is not when iPads were in abundance like they are now during COVID. Is that they got that for the duration of the first part of treatment to see how that helped them with engagement and treatment outcomes. And what was nice is that the families that were randomized to the eBook plus PCIT group, that they did actually experience fewer disruptive behaviors at mid-treatment based on the parents' report. And we did see at the end of treatment that there were equally clinical significant reductions in disruptive behaviors at post. So that part is nice because we're not seeing that sometimes less is more. We're seeing that in this instance, at least more is the same. And we did see a trend towards better maintenance of behavioral improvements at a 3-month follow-up. The other part that was nice, again, not statistically significant, but if you were to expand this over a larger population, is that we did have a 10% higher treatment completion rate in those that had that kind of extra support. But with anything, sometimes there can be some downside to that. So the families that were in the traditional PCIT, again, while not significant, I will say that we aim for kind of this skill criteria of them achieving in a 5-minute behavior observation, like 30 plus verbalizations of a certain kind. And what we saw is that even though both maintained above that 30 verbalization threshold at 3-month follow-up, is that the group that was in traditional PCIT maintained that a bit better. And that may be because the learning was a little bit more difficult and they didn't kind of have like a cheat sheet to kind of go back and check. So those are things to keep in mind with respect to that. In terms of technology-driven interventions, we in this past year have launched PCIT Universal as a part of Parent Club. That is something that's available locally from the Children's Trust. And while it started as these in-person workshops, this was something where they went virtual because of COVID-19. And we think, that not everything needs to be delivered by a licensed psychologist, right? Or a licensed professional, that we can train more of a paraprofessional staff to deliver these behavioral principles, especially, even if they are someone that they themselves are a parent that are also applying these things that can increase relation. So we think about that as even being like something that kind of begins to mirror more of like a community health worker or a natural helper model, which is stuff that we've done with some of our other work. And essentially is we developed these kind of one and done workshops that were to deliver the behavioral principles of PCIT about child development, positive parenting, and positive behavior. So they're getting, the discipline skills and the positive attention. And what's been cool to see this happen at more of a population level, and we're just one of 3 agencies that are doing this, is that we've been able to go to these virtual workshops, so kind of group webinars, kind of like you're on right now. And just in the first year, they were able to serve over 2,000 participants right here in Miami-Dade. Now that number is much larger when we look at the overall group. Now, finally, a lot of us have gotten more used to looking at a computer camera for several hours a day. We were doing telehealth, a telehealth version of PCIT before COVID-19, and then we've been exclusively doing telehealth PCIT or I-PCIT since March of this year, and we have a paper under review. This paper was led by Nelly Garcia. Again, really brilliant team. Everyone kind of pitched in and kind of helping us roll over to that. So Angela Blizzard was a part of that too. Abby Peskin has been huge in terms of leading our communities of practice related to telehealth. And again, you look down the list, like this was a huge team effort to get us where we're at in terms of being able to serve. What was cool to see with Family Navigators, which is a local program, is that our referral rates actually went up after COVID-19 hit, because we were still in business, we were still delivering services. So when we think about I-PCIT, it's still that live coaching model. So we are kind of like this, where you're looking at a computer screen, where we're actually coaching someone live over, we use Zoom for healthcare for that purpose, and we're still engaging in kind of what we would be doing in session, but the families in their natural environment. And during COVID-19, while we have plenty of iPads and mounts and Bluetooth headsets and hotspots that we can lend out to families, is that families really weren't comfortable coming to the hospital center during that time. And I can understand that. So we're kind of just using the devices that they had. So we're able to use phones with Bluetooth headsets, their tablets, computers that they had. Sometimes they use a tablet for the video, but then they call in and use the phone so they can hear the coaching. Like I'm wearing AirPods right now, they would have a wired headset, and all those different formats really allow us to do that. If they don't have any headset, we're able to coach through a speakerphone. So we make it work no matter what the family has with respect to that. And the part that was really cool that Dr. Garcia helped to move along with the greater team is that it's not just during this stay-at-home order where we were really looking at things, but we wanted to look at kind of what training did and how that was actually related to some of the changes that we saw over a 2-month period. And I think one of the real strengths of this is that for all of these families, we had baseline data. So we knew how they were doing prior to this COVID-19 onset. And so during this period, we had some therapists trained, but we had to train most of our staff to deliver this. And what was really cool to see is that we developed some internally recorded telehealth trainings. We made them kind of freely available on YouTube. And then with Abby leading or facilitating this telehealth community of practice, is that our therapists who actually utilize these training efforts, those things were actually related to decreases in children's disruptive and internalizing behaviors, which I think was a really cool finding. With respect to child outcomes, even during the stay-at-home, so things were really stressful for lots of people. I think one of the things that I think was really awesome to see is that child outcomes were still moving in the right direction. We're still seeing child compliance go up. We were still seeing during a very stressful period, parenting stress was going down. Parents were still increasing their positive parenting skills. And also just they were increasing the effective discipline skills as well. So we're real excited about this work. Our next step is really kind of look at what it looks like for all those families that we enrolled after the start of COVID. But with that, I turn it over to Jill.
Thank you so much, Jason. So my lab in the Department of Psychology, the Child and Adolescent Mood and Anxiety Treatment Program, has not been known for traditionally providing technology-based interventions or technology-assisted interventions. We've really been known for doing effective psychotherapy research on children and adolescents with internalizing or emotional disorders in a face-to-face model. And when the pandemic hit, we made a very quick pivot, inspired a lot by the work that Jason does in PCIT, over to telehealth, and also started thinking about the needs of the populations that we serve. And so a lot of the work that I'm sending to you is work in development or projects that we have in development. And so please forgive me for not having a ton of data to present at this point, but we've only really been at this since March. But I'll give you a sense of, kind of going the opposite direction, really starting with our technology assisted program and kind of moving to where we're sort of headed in some self-directed spaces as well. A little bit of what we're doing right now. You can go ahead. Thank you. So one good thing to know in sort of making this transition for us anyway, from face-to-face evidence-based psychotherapies for these concerns over to telehealth, is that there is a wealth of research, some of it done by colleagues like at FIU, Jonathan Comer, and others, that have already suggested that the effect sizes when providing these evidence-based psychotherapy models via telehealth are at least equivalent to the really good effect sizes that we already see from traditional doses of face-to-face evidence-based therapies, cognitive behavior therapy or exposure with response prevention-based therapies. And in some cases, there may even be some advantages to these approaches. Next slide. So for us, we were all very nervous, I suppose, in sort of making this transition. Was a lot, as I'm sure it was for all of you, to make this transition originally. And, if you didn't have the structures and supports to do it in the beginning, that can be overwhelming. But what we've seen initially, and as we've gotten greater and greater amounts of experiences, are some really interesting advantages to doing exposure-based treatments or activation-based treatments in this model. We are often trying to achieve what we call, inhibitory learning, or better inhibitory learning through these processes by doing things more naturalistically, with more variability in people's own environments, and telehealth really assists with that quite a bit. You can do activation in their home or out front of their house, on a mobile device. You can sometimes identify exposures to do within their environment that are really things you might not have thought of, or were even more potent because they are within their day-to-day experience. You can leverage caregiver involvement in order to sort of generalize or facilitate outcomes. And you can practice in, again, new and interesting ways in sessions that might promote generalization. Now, we could say that there are, of course, many other sort of decreased barriers, as Jason was hinting at and talking about. We may be able to get a lot more people involved in services this way, who might have had difficulties engaging with a face-to-face model because of sort of transportation barriers or other kinds of issues around work. But, there are some trade-offs. I think that we are just kind of, at some points, understanding that engagement can be harder. Sometimes attention can wane. You might have to vary the model of how the materials are presented. But I think we can see, as we have been practicing, why there is this equivalency between approaches. Go ahead to the next slide. So what we have been doing is providing all of our evidence-based psychotherapy models via telehealth, but we've also launched a study that was funded by the University of Miami Office of the Vice Provost for Research, Rapid Response to COVID-19 Fund, called Co-Parent, or Coping, COVID-19 Parent Action in Response to Emotions and Needs for Treatment. Very, very wordy title. I wanted to first, before describing the study, just kind of acknowledge any kind of clinical research is a team sport, and all of these amazing, powerful women have been very involved with this study as therapists, as coordinators, as research assistants. I also wanted to know some of them are on your teams as well, like Nisa Tonerelli, and some of them are with, like, Amy Beaumont, who have been great participants in this study as well. You can go on to the next slide. So what is Co-Parent? Well, Co-Parent is a 4-session telehealth directed intervention for caregivers who are experiencing emotional distress during COVID-19. So this is really for parents who have elevated anxiety, depression, or traumatic stress symptoms. And why did we do this? Well, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I really wanted you to understand that if you are not aware that the caregivers of the children that you are working with are having mental health problems right now, please go ahead and ask them about that, because the fact of the matter is, even without sort of having necessarily children in the home environment, most adults are experiencing, well, I wouldn't say most adults, but up to 40 to 50% of adults are experiencing significant, more than nothing anxiety or depression symptoms. And there are certain people who are more particularly vulnerable to experiencing some of these key anxiety and depression symptoms during this time. And that does include women, younger individuals, people of lower income, persons of color, who are also affected by other world stressors beyond COVID-19 right now. And the fact that we are all experiencing some mental health problems during this time is not surprising. We have research from the disaster mental health literature from prior quarantines that would suggest these events in the world right now are specific vulnerability factors for mental health concerns like this. Can you go on to the next slide? So we focus on caregivers, partially because we know from research on prior disasters that caregivers who are quarantined with their children, and particularly those who have prior mental health concerns, are at much greater risk for some particular mental health concerns, for example, traumatic stress. And of course, for those of you who are parents, there's no surprise why this might be. There's a lot of role conflict. There's a lot of There's a lot of frenzy and irritability and worry that is going into most people's day-to-day functioning as they are kind of moving between activities frequently throughout the day and experiencing distress. And their children also maybe as well. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so the study that we're doing, we basically included any parent who was experiencing elevated anxiety, depression, or traumatic stress symptoms who was living in the state of Florida and had access to the technology needed to do the telehealth. We recruited via social media predominantly, but also through a number of sort of helpful assistance from agencies here in South Florida. We randomized individuals who qualified for the study to either receive the 4-session intervention immediately or after a 4-week delay. Sorry, after a 6-week delay, rather. Thank you. So this is the sample that we have. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we have 80 individuals who were randomized to a study condition on a 2-to-1 ratio. Most of them were female, most of them were white, most of them were Hispanic or Latinx. About 10% participated in Spanish and the rest in English. And we have, when we looked at their clinical symptoms, most of them were in the mild to moderate range, but there was quite a range that we saw. And again, we only required mild symptomatology of this in this sample to be included, but some of them did have more severe symptoms. Go on to the next slide. So one thing that I want to note, and one thing we're really interested in, is just also taking a look at when they entered the study. We were recruiting people from the points of kind of more acute quarantine all the way through August, when things had changed and some social distancing behaviors had changed. We're taking a very close look at the different COVID experiences that people have had during this time. And how that might relate to outcomes. This is just a bit of a snapshot. You can see some people had very acute stressors related to COVID-19, and other people may have had more common symptoms. In a presentation that I did yesterday, we have a much larger sample of parents we've also been collecting with several colleagues, about 1,800 parents. And in that sample where we were looking at COVID experiences, also a good proportion, about 25%, had reported racism or discrimination associated with COVID-19 related healthcare or other services. So I think that is also something for us to keep an eye on here as well. Next slide. What we did intervention-wise was provide something that we've been doing pretty much historically in our program, which was provide a transdiagnostic cognitive behavioral model called the Unified Protocol. We took aspects of the adult and child protocols and combined them and adapted them for COVID-19. It was an interesting experience. We've never done a group this. Basically, we had people come in for a first session. They didn't come in, they came in virtually for a first session that was almost at the immediate point that they were eligible to be in their session. So from the immediate condition or the delayed condition, they got that first session, usually within the first week that they were eligible to get it. And then we put them into a rolling group. So we had 5 groups that were pretty much going on all the time. And they were going from sessions 2, 3, and 4, and then just back to 2 again. And people could join at any point. So the composition of the groups could be very different week to week, but the therapists were the same across these groups. Next slide. So we're very passionate about transdiagnostic CBT. We think that this helps with dissemination of treatments because we're really leveraging evidence-based psychotherapy principles that are common across a lot of different protocols that already exist for emotional disorders like anxiety, depression, traumatic stress, OCD. But what we focused on here predominantly were 2 things. One, improving parents' emotion management skills using these sort of known techniques for managing such. So things like psychoeducation, working on personalized behavior change plans that were consistent with that individual's values, and thinking through mindful strategies as well as flexible thinking strategies and problem-solving strategies that could be helpful during this moment, right? We can't control everything during this moment, but we might be able to deal with our stress a little bit differently. The other thing we focused on within these sessions were at least 1 to 2 parenting strategies that we felt would be helpful for this age group between 6 and 13, and that were based in some of the what we call opposite parenting behavior strategies that we often teach parents who are experiencing difficulties managing their child with emotional disorders as well. Next slide. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of data from one person that we have a case paper on that is under review for publication right now. We are almost done. We've recruited our entire sample, which I've never done a randomized controlled trial this fast in my life, but this is the nature of these brief telehealth interventions. And so this is Angelina, who had 2 children in our age range. She was experiencing financial difficulties, which is really common in our sample. Had very high anxiety. I would say for me, we saw a lot of parents with high anxiety, a lot of parents with high irritability. So there was kind of these 2 groups, I felt like. Over time, this was one of our higher anxiety parents, but she reported symptomatology across the board. In fact, she had some suicidal ideation as well. We assessed her more thoroughly, and it turned out to be very mild and no risk. But, you know, that's how much distress she was having at the moment. And so just to go to some of her findings, if we go to the next slide. In essence, what we saw was a really precipitous dip in all of her symptoms to well below the clinical cutoff across the board. She really was able to use these valued actions to kind of help guide her behavior. She was practicing the strategies. And this was only 4 sessions, mind you. So this was not, you know, although we were really focusing on these key ingredients to change, this was a very brief intervention. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And obviously we don't know, this is just over 6 weeks. So we don't know, you know, what the longer term is. We're going to follow them again at a 12-week time point. So we'll get some slightly more distal outcomes, but this is very promising to us. And next slide. You can also see on the next slide that there is also a real increase in her self-efficacy or a sense of parenting confidence or satisfaction. And interestingly, we also saw reports of some change in her child. So I think that that's something for us to keep an eye on here as well as we go forward. Next slide. So we are working on a lot of different telehealth research projects in development. We've been collaborating with the School Health Initiative at Mailman to develop some telehealth-based applications of our transdiagnostic approach for adolescents. We're very excited about that. We hope that that's going to get funded by the Institute for Educational Sciences. We're also hoping to continue this, what we call Unified Protocol for Caregivers model. We've been working with the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities on the possibility of leveraging this for parents of children with autism spectrum disorders. And I didn't mention this when going over the sample, but we have noted probably almost, you know, a quarter of our sample had children with special needs or children who had autism spectrum disorders. And so we think this may be a particular risk group that we want to spend more time tailoring the intervention for. Next. So with the 5 minutes or so that I have left, let me tell you about an exciting new direction that we've been working with a colleague of mine, Jessica Schleider, who is a professor at Stony Brook on. And this is really going to that kind of self-directed model. We know, as was already discussed, that one of the real limitations, even of our 4-session approach, right, for caregivers or for youth, you know, are that most children are not getting anything. And that is a big concern because we are also seeing, in addition to caregiver psychopathology and internalizing concerns going up, these concerns going up quite a bit during this time for children as well. So how can we deal with this problem, given that there is in no way enough providers to tackle this problem? We just don't have them. And that is something we have to face as a field. So one thing we can think about is something that may be providing a small effect for a larger number of people as a stopgap measure or as a partial movement toward getting some of these individuals the care that they need. So this single session intervention model that really Dr. Schleider has been pioneering has some possibilities here from the initial data to really help a good number of people. And what are these interventions? But they're really these tightly packed 20 to 30 minute long digital interventions that focus on a core mechanism or a core element of effective psychotherapy that already exists for these kinds of, and predominantly she's focused on internalizing concerns. And the hope is that, this kind of focus makes these obviously both potent and easier to disseminate. Next slide. So this is just some of her research, just to kind of underscore some of these points that I've already mentioned. These brief single session interventions have been shown to both decrease risk as well as specific symptoms of youth anxiety and depression in both high symptom and community samples. Now, I want to put that in context. These are small effects. These are brief interventions, not the same as getting a full dose of therapist-assisted psychotherapy, but this is a place to kind of find, again, a short-term solution to a much bigger problem, because these SSIs can obviously potentially mitigate some key access barriers. They're self-administered, right? And they can be administered any time of day or night. They're consumer directed. The consumer decides to use them. They are web-based, and again, they are very brief. All of Dr. Schleider's single session interventions are also fully available to the public. She has put everything on an open science platform and put it in Qualtrics, so it is easily taken and accessible on somebody else's Qualtrics as well. So this model of open science and sharing that she has taken into this work has also been very innovative and made it much more widely available to the public right from the start. Next slide. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures, really, from, again, the publicly available stuff that she has. This is her website, schleiderlab.org. And this is just some pictures from her adolescent-directed depression intervention, which is Project ABC, Actions Bring Change. And this is focusing on one key mechanism. So they're trying to focus on here is hopelessness, and they're looking very briefly both before and after at changes in sort of hopelessness in the moment that you have completed it, but they're also looking at adolescents' response to, say, like 2 weeks later after they've completed, and they're showing good maintenance of gains. And this is tackling hopelessness to increase activation. It's a very specific goal, targeting a key mechanism that we think can improve these symptoms overall. Next slide. As an anxiety researcher myself, that's where I came from. That's what I love. I'm really excited about this other project that she's been working on, Project Brave, which is really in line also with some work that has been going on by Ellie Leibowitz at Yale, which has shown that focusing on the mechanism of parental accommodation of avoidance and anxious distress can affect change for children with anxiety disorders at a similar level to child-directed cognitive behavioral intervention. So what she's done is sort of take that principle and put it into a 20 to 30 minute single session intervention for parents of children with elevated anxiety. And again, these are just a couple of snapshots from the intervention. I do want to point out that it's not just didactic. There is a lot of didactic information in there, but it is very interactive. So, there are questions, answers, examples that are coming through. It is just on Qualtrics, so it's not high tech, but it is as interactive as I think it can be in that format. Next slide. So I've already pointed out some common limitations to this approach, but we're very excited to be working with her. And we have a funding application in right now to kind of make these widely available here in the South Florida community, and also culturally and linguistically tailor them. These were really developed, in New York, in the Stony Brook area, and all the nationally available in some of the samples. The idea of trying to work with lower income samples and culturally and linguistically tailor them has been some of the focus of our initial collaboration. And we're also really interested in working together to create a suite of these single session interventions that would correspond to some of the key modules and mechanisms in evidence-based cognitive behavioral approaches for youth with internalizing disorders, and particularly adolescents, and use things like adolescents' preferences and peer-generated feedback to allow adolescents to select the things that they think they might want to use. And we think the suite might be something that you could put in a pediatric office, or you could put in a school library, or other places could effectively use something in a class period when they're in the library, and potentially get some benefit, and then leave some feedback for other kids about why it was helpful or not helpful. So we're excited about that direction as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
So just a final slide is when we think about kind of where we want this digital mental health research to move forward. Moore, who's just does tons of really amazing stuff up at Northwestern, is that there was a suggestion about kind of some general misconceptions about digital mental health research. One is that mental health technologies are products. And I think the reconceptualization of that is that they are in fact technology-enabled services. So as you demonstrate, as I showed, like you have significant drop-off if you do not have human interaction with these things, right? So there is a climate, an organization, there is a organizational support structure in which these things are being deployed, and all of those things enable the technology to actually benefit mental health, not just the product. Efficacy trials are needed to provide validation. There's enough digital mental health literature out there that shows with RCTs that in many ways that it can be pretty effective for a broad array of psychiatric disorders, whether it's by itself with some human support or it's more of a technology assisted program. But this has really happened within like a top-down approach of like, I'm going to decide what I think is best for you, which can introduce our own biases into the mix. And what there is a need for is for these technology-enabled services for really their users to tell you a little bit more about their preferences, their behavioral patterns in terms of how they utilize mobile apps or even websites. And these things need to be evaluated in more of a hybrid or even a re-aim framework that would allow for us to evaluate these in the place where they're actually being deployed. And if we just think about things as digital or technology-enabled services as a mental health technology, as a new way of delivering psychotherapy. So we're essentially taking what we would do in psychotherapy and just throwing it online, or we're putting it within an app format. We're really limiting kind of what this actually could be. It really can be something that revolutionizes mental health care. So if we think about things like virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, natural language processing, where I can say something or I can type something, and there's AI that's running that can give me feedback based on that. All of those things can completely shift the paradigm in terms of how we actually engage in mental health research. But all of that's going to take a lot of interprofessional work, right? Like most of us psychologists, we didn't get a degree in business. We are not computer or science engineers. There's a lot of ethics in terms of who's getting what information and what that information is being used for. So we know that this has to be an interprofessional approach to actually make this happen. So with that, we'll thank you for hanging out with us, and we'll turn it over for any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Jason and Jill. We are already at 5 of, so let me just ask one question to sort of wrap this up, because I think one of the ideas, there are many pediatricians and pediatric providers on the call. And as we started from the beginning, there are so many people who need services and nowhere near enough mental health professionals. So the old approach of, identify a problem, refer to a mental health professional just isn't going to work. And I know both you, Jill and Jason, have talked about sort of a step-up approach where you might be able to start with a self-contained technology and then move up to other things. I wonder if you would say a word or two about that, and then we'll end.
I don't know if you want to start, Jason.
Sure. I mean, just real quick. I mean, it's something we've thought a lot about in terms of, because we know even within behavioral parent training, over the course of like 3 or 4 sessions, people get better. So, you know, we have people going for these very long treatments where you can lose engagement over time. So I think this idea of assessing and then having a short duration or even a self-directed version with some human support, and then kind of reassessing and then determining if you need to triage up, stay the same, or maybe they're good enough. I think that is kind of where we're going to see the field move as a whole. I think in Miami-Dade County, we have that set up very well with respect to parenting to kind of move in that direction, but it's not systematic and or coordinated at this point in time. But I'll turn over to Jill if she has thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that Jason said. I think that we have the ideas of how to proceed in this nature, and I think it's really about bringing the systemic structures around it. I love, for example, that at Mailman you have these patient navigators, you know, who can really help with the coordination of care, because, you know, we can send somebody to do these self-directed interventions. We don't know if they do them sometimes and whether they need something different or another. So somebody needs to be monitoring that to see whether they now need some additional referral. And I think this is where kind of thinking forward about how does this integrate with some of these pediatric structures is what's needed on sort of a broader scale basis. And I think we still can't ignore that we really still need more providers. I think at the end of the day, although these technology assistance models are going to kind of bring more help to more people on an early care level, we know that many of them will still need the assistance of a therapist, a trained, skilled therapist in these evidence-based therapy models, and that technology alone cannot fully replace that. And so I think we all still need to be thinking about how do we increase the provider base overall, you know, as we work to the future while we increase the availability of these technology sources.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jill and Jason. If we were in an auditorium and in real life, you guys would hear all of the applause now from our audience. We really appreciate your taking the time to lay out what are some of the really interesting and revolutionizing approaches to providing mental health, and look forward to further discussions about how we can put this into practice. Thank you everyone for joining us for the Mailman Center Grand Rounds at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Have a great day. Bye-bye.